When I started making this video, it was to show that there was indeed an ancient Proto-Bantu Kingdom in southern Africa that was destroyed by the Death Lord Mzilikazi. But as I dug deeper, I started to find questionable connections, edits, and unconvincing narratives. The official narrative paints Mzilikazi as a great Zulu warrior out of the Zulu nation and one of the causes of the Mfecane, who terrorized and destroyed all surrounding nations as he migrated north looking for land to settle and build his own kingdom. That he was just ambitious. This story makes sense when we ignore that Mzilikazi primarily spoke Swana, that he had contact with the Cape colonists, and if we take Robert Moffat to be the benevolent grandfatherly Santa Claus NPC who lovingly chides the natives while steering them to the right path. A true friend of Africa. But analysis of this data shows Robert Moffat playing a much deeper and disturbing role. That it was Moffat who instructed Mzilikazi to instruct his trusted Induna, Gundawane, to lead the children and the women and Mzilikazi's heir to the location within the Nanza kingdom. Although Moffat never mentions the Nanzas, or having any contact with them, or having received permission from their king to lead Mzilikazi's teenage heir to that region, Robert Moffat gave Mzilikazi orders to encroach on the oldest Proto-Bantu Kingdom, and when Mzilikazi succeeded in destroying it, Mzilikazi refused to receive anyone until Robert Moffat arrived, and when Moffat arrived, Mzilikazi took his hand and said, "The land is before you. You are come to your son. You must sleep where you please." This gives the impression that Mzilikazi was handing over a completed mission. Mzilikazi also called Moffat father or Umbate, which is correctly pronounced Ndate. This is taken from Robert Moffat's missionary labors and scenes in southern Africa, and this meeting happened between late 1838 and 1839 on the heels of the destruction of the Proto-Bantu Kingdom. When these details are factored in, Moffat's work stops reading like a missionary observer, but starts to read like an intelligence report. Another issue with Moffat is this passage from the same visit. When the moving houses, as the wagons were called, drew near, he, Mzilikazi, took a firmer grasp of Moffat's arm, and looked on them with unutterable surprise. And this man, the terror of thousands, drew back with fear, as one in doubt as to whether they were not living creatures. Moffat gives us the impression that Mzilikazi had never seen a wagon. But here's a passage from William Cornwallis Harris's visit in 1836. In order that there might be no excuse for delaying our departure, we sent Baba, which is Zulu for father, in the afternoon to ask the king's permission to pitch the house in his kraal. He was taking a siesta in Mr. Bain's wagon, but came out immediately in high spirits. Mr. Bain's wagon had been a wagon Mzilikazi's fighters had raided and stolen while in Transvaal, where Mzilikazi targeted wagons, especially those attempting to cross the Vaal River without permission from Kuruman. Kuruman was run by Robert Moffat. Mzilikazi called Moffat the king of Kuruman. The point is that Mzilikazi knew what a wagon was, and Moffat is misleading the reader. Moffat never built a church in Mzilikazi's territory until the 1850s, but this video is a start into the hidden history of southern Africa, which was replaced by the narrative that it was ruled by savage and civilized murdering people like Shaga and Mzilikazi, when they were more likely Cape colonist ops with handlers like Moffat. Well, that's a theory. My theory is based on the data that the Cape colonists may have designed the Mfecane. There is evidence they trained Dingiswayo when he was at the Cape, who trained Shaga, who trained Mzilikazi, who received orders to carry out the depopulation of the kingdoms and people such as these, so the Cape colonists could colonize the land and take the resources. This is the video I initially created before I found discrepancies in the data. It uses Emil Holub's writings that helped identify these people whom Moffat never named, although he got many first-hand accounts of the terror of the destruction of their home from survivors. But he never names them. He just presents their story as a tragic footnote of nameless people in history. Like Mzilikazi, Moffat knew their name, but attempted to erase them by not naming them. Such as have dared to be brave in defense of their town, their wives and their children are reserved a still more terrible death, Dry grass saturated with fat is tied around their naked bodies and then set on fire. This is one of the atrocities that awaited the families Mzilikazi raided and plundered. He and his fighters would do this and many more unspeakable things to the Proto-Bantu and their kingdom before building his domain on the dust and ashes of its people. In mid-1838, the Nanzas in the capital and surrounding towns watched in confusion as smoke rose up from the towns in the distance. The fire and smoke seemed to emanate from the recently resettled Gundawane-led Ndebele horde, which had Mzilikazi's teenage son. Venzu, which means they are friends, the Nanzas exclaimed in an attempt to assuage their fears and confusion. For no one had breached the walls of their vast and wealthy kingdom for hundreds of years, not since the split caused by the Mwene Mutapa, which means master thieves. It had withstood invasions from the Mutapas and all the chaos that had ensued from their proclivities. The Nanzas were renowned diplomats who preferred to use diplomacy to avoid bloodshed. But those who dared to attack their kingdom had fled from the towns in shame and fear. The Nanza warriors, who were great in number and experience, had always prevailed. I shall slay them and hang up their shields on my hill. Our race is a race of warriors. Whoever subdued our fathers, they were mighty in combat. But on this winter's night, during the rain-making and Thanksgiving festival in mid-1838, they watched fire and smoke rise from the town assigned to their newly settled guests, and when it spread to other towns, they realized the enemies were within. Mzilikazi and his fighters had managed to breach the walls of their kingdom. They would burn, murder, abduct, and destroy as Mzilikazi made his way towards the royal court on the mountain, and once it was over, the Ndebele would successfully destroy and almost erase all traces of the 2,000-year-old Proto-Bantu Kingdom in southern Africa. The Nanza warriors would do their duty and defend their home, but the kingdom's diplomacy and resettlement policy would finally fail everyone and result in their genocide and dispersion. By 1837, the news of Mzilikazi's disrepute had spread across the plateaus of southern Africa, from south of the Limpopo to the north of the Zambezi and everywhere in between. The cruelty and viciousness of the Ndebele was well known, but Mzilikazi's cunning and genocidal nature, along with the depths of his connection to Robert Moffat and by proxy the Cape colonists and their goals, may have been underestimated by the king of the Nanzas, who used diplomacy and made every accommodation, including standing down his warriors and probably allowing the resettlement of the Ndebele women and children within his realm, since Mzilikazi was reportedly killed. This would prove to be a fateful decision because Mzilikazi was alive. Mzilikazi's name means one who dwells within the absence of sound, the absence of the sacred life force. It basically means pure evil. It was a name he never failed to live up to. The official narrative states that Mzilikazi's cunning and genocidal nature had revealed itself early in his life when he betrayed Chaga, who saved his life from the masumo, or spears, of his maternal grandfather who had ordered the death of Mzilikazi's father for treason. The narrative says the betrayal of Chaga sent Mzilikazi on the run with approximately 40 followers who later became nobles within the Ndebele. Together they targeted settled agrarian communities, especially those among the Swazis and the Vejana, who are now called Botswana, where they destroyed, pillaged, burned, and abducted boys who were forcefully used as fighters, and girls who were forcefully used as comfort women, breeders, and laborers. After the pillaging, Mzilikazi and his fighters would abandon any infants to the mercy of vultures, lions, and hyenas, and burn their parents and all married women. He also murdered anyone he suspected of being disloyal within his ranks by drowning or throwing them off hills. Mzilikazi was a murderer with a fighting force which he expanded through abduction and controlled using extreme punishments, thrashings, or even death. After his fighting force was defeated by the Griquas and the Zulus led by Dingani, according to the official narrative, Mzilikazi led his growing horde to Shwapango Hills, a last place of refuge as he attempted to put distance between himself and Dingani, whom he feared. Dingani had put an end to Chaga and was now the leader of the Zulus. Shwapango Hills was between the Vejana, or Botswanas, to the west, and the Nanza, the ancient Proto-Bantu Kingdom, to the east. The Ndebele horde, now numbering approximately 15,000 people, was split into two divisions. The first, made up of fighting men and led by Mzilikazi, is said to have gone northwest and then north, where they raided and abducted more fighting-aged men and boys, while his trusted Induna, Gundawane, led the second horde made up of women and children and Mzilikazi's heir into Nanza territory. Gundawane is said to have declared Mzilikazi dead and installed Mzilikazi's son as heir. This assertion would have been the only way Gundawane would have been allowed to resettle within the realm of the Namanza. The Namanza made every sacrifice to come to reasonable terms with the Ndebele. It seems he went as far as resettling the second horde led by Gundawane and providing them provisions, security, food, land, cattle, and comforts. He did just as his ancestors had done in approximately 1038 AD with the people who were a mix of Great Lakes ethnic Bantu, Neolithic Kushites who arrived fleeing the slave trade, and the Arabs who had destroyed their kingdoms on the East African coast. These groups were resettled at Great Zimbabwe, where they became the ancestors of the Nguni people. Mzilikazi was not dead, and arrived with reinforcements from the captives he had abducted in the north. Survivor accounts of what happened were shared with Robert Moffat and Emil Holub by some brave Nanza survivors who risked death to have their story recorded, but also because Moffat kept prying, and it may have not been innocent. On the night of the massacre, the Nanzas saw clouds of smoke coming from the towns in the direction of the land that had been allocated to resettle Gundawane. More data is needed to understand why Moffat sent them to this specific location, because Mzilikazi had been begging Moffat for a cannon prior to this. And we know that Mzilikazi's fighters were more effective in the plains, which is where this battle primarily took place. Upon observing the smoke, the Namanza and his people in the capital realized the Ndebele were attacking. Mzilikazi had breached their kingdom. Mzilikazi and his fighters set fire to the towns and the homes and began murdering the Nanzas. The Nanza warriors quickly armed themselves and proceeded down to the plain to defend their king and home. The official story says they were not enough to repel the Ndebele attack. The Ndebele were just better. They were also hardened in battle and spent every day training for battle, and in general much sturdier than their opponents of the same age. But the complete destruction of the Nanza stone homes and structures leads us to believe the weapons used during this attack were more than just fire and Ndebele rage. Surviving Nanzas sought refuge at the capital, which was on the mountaintop. Down in the plain, the Ndebele emerged victorious and set fire to the houses, fields, gardens, cattle, murdered mothers, and cast their infants into fires as they advanced and surrounded the base of the mountain. The Ndebele speared anyone they found until their hands were said to be weary of the spear. It was a genocide of the Nanza. The king, Namanza, is said to have stayed at the royal court to allow survivors from the capital to escape the onslaught. It worked because Mzilikazi focused on getting to the royal court, where he is said to have ascended the mountain and continued to murder. When Mzilikazi finally entered the royal court, he located the king in the fighting and overpowered him. Mzilikazi pierced the king and tore out the king's heart, and as the king was dying, Mzilikazi pressed the king's heart to the king's lips and shrieked, "You had two hearts, one was false, and you shall eat it." The great house had fallen. Surviving warriors, arriving reinforcements, and priests made safe passage for those who could flee as the clashing of shields continued. In their thirst for blood, the Ndebele continued to chase who they could, slaughtering both humans and their cattle. Cattle were sacred and important to the Nanza. Their capital, towns, writings, property, and bodies were burned to ash. 2,000 years of life and more was now just dust and ashes. Nothing now remained but dilapidated walls, heaps of stone and rubbish mingled with human skulls, which to a contemplative mind told their ghastly tale. Because the devil's always in the details, Robert Moffat said the Ndebele used fire to burn down the stone homes and the stone towns, which resulted in heaps of stone. But how can fire result in heaps of stone? That was a blast. Seems likely that Robert Moffat had supplied Mzilikazi with the cannon William Cornwallis Harris had talked about. The Ndebele ultimately emerged victorious and built their heritage on the dust of a kingdom they destroyed. Modern-day Ndebele land sits atop the pillaged dust and ruins of the ancient Proto-Bantu Kingdom, which was the first and oldest kingdom in southern Africa. That linked southern Africa to ancient Egypt, that had a policy of forbidding untrustables from entering there. After destroying it, Mzilikazi appropriated some of their culture and tried to hide their existence in this genocide by murdering anyone who spoke up. Some survivors chose to stay in their homeland, where they unfortunately were turned into slaves to the Ndebele. Others survived because the Nanza realized his kingdom was falling to the Ndebele and gave custody to the chief priest, the Mose, who led some survivors to safety northeast before the Ndebele arrived and sieged the capital. But Mzilikazi continued to hunt them down, so they crossed the Zambezi and migrated further into modern-day Zambia and became known as the Batonga, which means those without a king or displaced people. They believe there has to be a body for a death to be complete. The body's mugwa, or muya, is the god-state attachment that has to be released to the heavens through a ceremony. Since the king's body was burned and never recovered at the royal court, and no ceremony to release his muya was ever performed, he is still present and is still king. This is one reason the Batonga Manza do not have a king. If you like this video and are interested in learning more about hidden Southern African history, ethnic Bantu history, the Proto-Bantu language, and mythology, please like and subscribe. You can show your support for this channel by buying us a coffee. The link is in the description below. I will add some thoughts here. You can end it here if you have no interest in going down rabbit holes. So let's begin here. There are still a lot of missing fragments to this very important story that ties Southern African history together. The content of this video is meant to help compose an accurate understanding of Southern African history and its place in world history. When I first started, I was simply looking for the links that tether the history of the Bantu people, not Bantu-speaking people who have been written about extensively, almost as if they were a replacement population. There's a difference between Bantu and Bantu-speaking people, and the simplest way to understand it is to think of how we can speak English. In doing this research, I realized Mzilikazi deliberately targeted and assassinated the king, and deliberately burnt down and destroyed this kingdom. Why wouldn't he simply usurp him and take it over if he was looking for a new place to settle? It was a nice kingdom with nice things, like really nice things, unless he was supposed to erase them. But why was he supposed to erase them? I suppose the answers can be found when we take time into account. Time is truly the only constant, and it doesn't lie. For example, Columbus sailed for the Americas on August 3rd, 1492. There's nothing there if you leave it at that. But what else happened that year? In fact, what happened 3 days before he sailed? July 31st, 1492. Did he go alone? What were the implications? When we consider the whole, rather than individual parts, we start to see details, and some of them might be very uncomfortable, which may be why history is largely taught in fragments and not holistically. One interesting thing found in William Cornwallis Harris's notes is that Mzilikazi spoke Swana and not Zulu. He also called Moffat Umbate, which is correctly pronounced Ndate, which is Swana for father, and not Umbaba, which is Zulu for father. Mzilikazi was supposed to be a noble Zulu king, so why would he speak the language of the people he had conquered and enslaved, the people he called dogs? There are now many questions, such as, how long was Dingiswayo in the Cape Colony? What did he do there? Because when he came back, apparently, the Zulu nation suddenly had a different way of fighting. They had standing armies. They fought in close formation. What is his connection to the Cape colonists? What was Shaka's connection to the Cape colonists? What was Mzilikazi's connection to the Cape colonists? Were their origin stories even real? Or are they just myths composed by their handlers like Robert Moffat to excite a bored British mind? I hope you like and subscribe for more, and don't forget to help this channel by giving to our coffee. The link is